March 29th, 1973. The Beverly Hilton ballroom buzzed with champagne and gossip. Producer Jack Kellerman had just publicly humiliated Steve McQueen in front of 300 Hollywood elite, calling him a two-bit pretty boy who couldn't act his way out of a paper bag. McQueen stood up slowly, straightened his bow tie, looked Kellerman dead in the eye. "You just ended the wrong career." 5 words that sent ripples through every studio in town. Within 6 months, Kellerman's projects were canceled. His phone stopped ringing and his name became poison. The industry whispered about McQueen's power, his connections, his ability to destroy lives with a single sentence. But they never knew what McQueen whispered to Kellerman afterward. They never knew about the envelope McQueen slipped him. And they never knew that sometimes the man who looks like the villain is actually trying to save everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dylan Cross lowered his phone, his cocaine-fueled grin faltering for just a moment. Something in the old man's voice had shifted the temperature in the bathroom, a quiet authority that didn't belong to someone holding a mop. "I still am," Mac had said, and those words hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired gun. Cross's entourage, 3 junior producers and his personal assistant, shuffled nervously behind him. They'd come here to celebrate, to bask in the glow of Cross's latest triumph. The $200 million deal with Meridian Pictures was supposed to be their coronation moment, the night that cemented Dylan Cross as the new king of Hollywood. Instead, they found themselves staring at a 62-year-old security guard who looked like he'd seen better decades. "Still somebody?" Cross laughed, but it came out forced now. "Buddy, you're mopping shit in an executive bathroom at midnight. That's not somebody. That's nobody with a pulse." Mac straightened slowly, his weathered hands still gripping the mop handle. In the harsh bathroom lighting, the lines on his face looked like battle scars. His gray hair was thinning, his uniform cheap polyester that had seen too many wash cycles. But his eyes belonged to a different man entirely. "Mr. Cross," Mac said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades. "Congratulations on your deal. $200 million for a franchise nobody asked for, backed by money that doesn't exist yet." Cross blinked. How did a night janitor know the details of his deal? The non-disclosure agreements alone were thicker than phone books. "Meridian's leverage to the hilt," Mac continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Interesting choice, partnering with Jonathan Haverstick, though I suppose you didn't know about his little problem with the Securities and Exchange Commission." The bathroom fell silent except for the persistent hum of fluorescent bulbs. Cross felt his mouth go dry. The SEC investigation into Meridian's finances was supposed to be buried so deep that even his own lawyers didn't know about it. "Who the fuck are you?" Cross whispered. Max smiled, not the broken smile of a defeated man, but something far more dangerous. Something that belonged in the shadows of old Hollywood, where careers were built on secrets and destroyed by whispers. "I'm exactly who I've always been," Max said. "I just stopped reminding people." One of Cross's junior producers tugged at his sleeve. "Dylan, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Cross snapped, his eyes never leaving Mac's face. The cocaine was wearing off now, replaced by something that felt suspiciously like fear. "You're just some washed-up studio hack. Probably got fired for embezzlement or sexual harassment. That's how it works with you old-timers." Mac set the mop against the wall with deliberate precision. When he moved, Cross noticed something he'd missed before, the way Mac carried himself. Not like a broken man, like a predator who'd been sleeping. "You know what your problem is, Dylan?" Mac asked, stepping closer. "You think power is about making noise, shouting loud enough that everyone knows you're in charge. But real power?" He paused, close enough now that Cross could smell his aftershave. "Expensive, not the kind a security guard should be wearing. Real power is knowing when to whisper." Cross's hand trembled slightly as he raised his phone again. "I'm recording this, asshole. Threatening a producer? That's grounds for what? Firing me?" Mac chuckled, and the sound sent ice through Cross's veins. "Son, I've been waiting 30 years for this conversation. You think I'm worried about a minimum wage security job? The entourage was backing toward the door now, sensing something they couldn't name but definitely didn't want to be part of. Cross found himself alone with the old man, trapped between marble sinks and growing dread. 30 years ago, Mac said quietly, I sat in an office 3 floors above this bathroom. Corner office with a view of the lot. I could greenlight a $100 million picture with a phone call. I could end careers with a whisper at the right lunch table. Cross's throat felt like sandpaper. Bullshit. Marcus McQueen, Mac said, and watched Cross's face drain of color. You might know the name from the trades. Mysterious departure. Personal reasons. Family obligations. The phone slipped from Cross's nerveless fingers, clattering on the tile floor. Everyone in Hollywood knew the legend of Marcus McQueen, the studio executive who'd vanished at the height of his power, leaving behind rumors and speculation that still circulated 3 decades later. Impossible, Cross breathed. Mac picked up Cross's phone, examined it with mild interest. You know what the beautiful thing about rock bottom is, Dylan? It's not where you fall. It's where you dig your foundation. He handed the phone back with a smile that belonged in a noir film. Welcome to my foundation. The bathroom door swung shut behind Cross and his retreating entourage, leaving Mac alone with the echo of their panicked footsteps. He listened to the sound fade down the marble corridor. Expensive leather soles against Italian tile, the percussion of fear in retreat. The fluorescent lights continued their electrical hymn overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the executive bathroom feel like an interrogation room. Mac picked up his mop, dipped it in the bucket, and resumed cleaning the floor with methodical precision. The same motions he'd performed every night for 3 years, 8 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. His reflection caught in the polished chrome of the paper towel dispenser. Weathered face, gray stubble, the kind of tired eyes that belonged to men who'd seen too much. But behind that carefully constructed mask of defeat, something else stirred. Something that had been sleeping for 30 years, waiting for exactly this moment. The phone in his breast pocket buzzed. A text from Sarah, his daughter. Dad, are you working late again? Remember you promised to call Emma before bedtime. Mac's fingers trembled slightly as he typed back. On my way home soon, sweetheart. Tell my granddaughter Grandpa loves her. Emma, 7 years old, with Sarah's green eyes and a laugh that could melt decades of accumulated ice around his heart. She was the one pure thing in his carefully reconstructed life, the reason he got up every morning and put on this polyester uniform that smelled faintly of industrial detergent and broken dreams. The bathroom door opened again. Jimmy Castellanos, head of security, poked his graying head inside. 23 years on the force before taking this job, and smart enough to know when something was off. Mac? Heard there was some kind of incident. Just a young producer celebrating too hard, Mac said without looking up from his mopping. Nothing I couldn't handle. Jimmy stepped inside, lowering his voice. That young producer was Dylan Cross. Word is, he just signed a deal that'll make him untouchable around here. Mac paused, wringing out the mop with deliberate care. Jimmy, in 30 years, what have you learned about untouchable people in this town? That they usually touch down hard when they fall. Exactly. Mac resumed mopping. Sometimes they just need a little help with gravity. Jimmy studied Mac's face in the mirror. After 3 years of working together, he'd learned to read the subtle shifts in the old man's expressions. Tonight, something was different. Tonight, Mac looked like a man who just remembered something important. You want to tell me what really happened in here? Mac considered this. Jimmy was solid, a good man who'd earned his trust through small kindnesses and professional respect. But some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with friends. Let's just say Mr. Cross learned something about the building's history tonight. Jimmy nodded slowly. In his experience, the less you knew about certain conversations in certain bathrooms, the better you slept. After Jimmy left, Mac finished cleaning and wheeled his cart toward the service elevator. The studio lot stretched out beyond the windows, sound stages and office buildings where dreams were manufactured on assembly lines. He'd once commanded this empire from the 32nd floor, back when Marcus McQueen was a name that made agents return calls and stars take meetings they didn't want to take. The elevator descended past floors that held ghosts of his former life. 28, where he'd greenlit Midnight in Morocco, the film that won 6 Oscars and launched 3 careers. 25, where he'd made the call that ended Victor Steinberg's directing career in a single afternoon. 22, where he'd first met Rebecca, the studio publicist who would become his wife, the mother of his child, and eventually the casualty of his carefully orchestrated downfall. The elevator reached the basement level. Mac pushed his cart through fluorescent-lit corridors that smelled of concrete and forgotten ambitions. His locker sat in a row with 20 others, each belonging to men and women who kept the studio running while the talent slept. Inside his locker, behind the spare uniform and safety manual, was a small leather journal. 3 decades of careful observations, meticulously recorded. Names, dates, connections, indiscretions. The kind of information that powerful people assumed had died with their secrets. Tonight he would add Dylan Cross to those pages. Not because the young producer had humiliated him. Mac had endured worse indignities in service of his long game. But because Cross had made the mistake of threatening to fire him, and that threat came dangerously close to the one thing Mac couldn't afford to lose. His phone buzzed again. A photo from Sarah, Emma in pajamas, holding a book, waiting for her grandfather's bedtime call. Mac smiled, the first genuine expression to cross his face all evening. Whatever came next, whatever chain reaction he'd just set in motion, it was all in service of that little girl's future. She would never know what her grandfather had once been, or what he'd done to build the foundation beneath her safe, normal life. But Dylan Cross was about to learn exactly who Marcus McQueen had always been. Mac pulled the leather journal from behind his spare uniform, its worn cover soft from decades of careful handling. He was about to open it when his phone rang, not buzzed, but actually rang. The old-fashioned ringtone he'd programmed for unknown numbers, the kind of call that usually meant telemarketers or wrong numbers. At 12:47 a.m., it meant something else entirely. He stared at the screen. The number was blocked, but something about the timing felt deliberate, calculated. After 30 years of careful anonymity, 2 disruptions in one night seemed like more than coincidence. Marcus McQueen. The silence stretched long enough that Mac almost hung up. Then, a voice from the grave spoke his name. "Hello, Mac." The journal slipped from Mac's fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a sound like a gunshot. He knew that voice. Smooth, cultured, with just the faintest trace of a Boston accent that money couldn't quite erase. A voice he hadn't heard since the night his world burned down 3 decades ago. Jonathan. It's been a long time. Jonathan Steinfeld's voice carried across the years like smoke from a fire Mac thought he'd extinguished. "Though I hear you've been keeping busy. Night security, wasn't it? How wonderfully poetic." Mac's hand tightened on the phone. His carefully controlled breathing faltered for just a moment, the first crack in his composure since Cross had walked into that bathroom. "I thought you were dead." "You thought a lot of things, Mac. Turned out you were wrong about most of them." The basement corridor suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher. Mac had built his new life on the assumption that certain people were buried deep enough to stay buried. Jonathan Steinfeld was supposed to be one of them. "What do you want?" Jonathan's laugh was exactly as Mac remembered, cultured, cold, and sharp enough to cut glass. Straight to business. "I always admired that about you. No small talk, no pretense, just pure, efficient ruthlessness." Mac said nothing, but his mind was racing. Jonathan Steinfeld had been his business partner, his closest ally, and ultimately his greatest enemy. The man who'd helped him build an empire and then tried to use Mac's own secrets to tear it down. The night Mac disappeared from Hollywood, Jonathan had disappeared too, but not by choice. "I want you to know," Jonathan continued, "that I've been watching. All these years, I've been watching you play your little game. The broken man, the fallen executive, the security guard with a secret. Very compelling performance." Through the phone, Mac could hear the sound of ice clinking against glass. Jonathan always did prefer his whiskey neat, but he liked the theater of ice. "I'm impressed by your restraint," Jonathan said. 30 years of keeping your mouth shut. 30 years of letting everyone think Marcus McQueen just disappeared. When we both know the truth is so much more interesting. Mac's reflections stared back at him from the dark window of a vending machine. A 62-year-old man in a polyester uniform holding a phone like it might explode. But inside, something else was happening. The careful walls he'd built around the past were cracking. You're supposed to be in federal prison. I was. 28 years, 4 months, 16 days. Got out on good behavior. Jonathan's voice carried a smile Mac couldn't see but could feel. Amazing what a man can accomplish when he has nothing but time and motivation. I learned so many interesting skills, made so many useful friends. Mac's mouth went dry. Jonathan in prison was one thing, contained, neutralized, forgotten. Jonathan free was a threat Mac hadn't planned for. But don't worry, Jonathan continued. I'm not calling for revenge. I'm calling because we have a mutual acquaintance now. Young Dylan Cross. Bright boy, ambitious, reminds me of someone I used to know. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. You're backing Meridian. Through several shell companies and a web of financial instruments that would take the SEC years to untangle, yes. Dylan doesn't know, of course. He thinks he's dealing with legitimate European investors. Poor boy has no idea he's dancing to music I composed 30 years ago. Mac closed his eyes. The basement corridor felt like it was spinning. Everything he'd carefully constructed, his anonymity, his security, his distance from the past, was collapsing in real time. You orchestrated tonight, Mac said. It wasn't a question. I orchestrated everything, Mac. Did you really think it was coincidence that Meridian Pictures decided to do business with your studio? That Dylan Cross happened to be working late? That he wandered into the exact bathroom where Marcus McQueen was mopping floors? Mac's legs felt weak. He leaned against his locker, the metal cool against his back. 30 years, Mac. 30 years I've been planning this conversation. The phone went dead. Mac stared at the device in his hand, knowing with absolute certainty that his carefully constructed life had just ended. Whatever came next, there was no going back to the safety of anonymity. The past hadn't just returned. It had been hunting him all along. Mac's legs buckled. He slid down the locker door until he was sitting on the cold concrete, the dead phone still pressed to his ear like he might hear Jonathan's voice again if he listened hard enough. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn overhead, the only sound in a basement that suddenly felt like a tomb. 30 years. 30 years of building a life around the illusion of safety, and Jonathan had been orchestrating every move from behind bars. Mac's hands shook as he tried to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. He'd planned for everything except this, his greatest enemy rising from a grave that was never quite deep enough. The leather journal lay open on the floor beside him, pages scattered, revealing decades of careful notes and observations. Names, dates, secrets, all worthless now. Everything he'd collected, every piece of ammunition he'd stockpiled, meant nothing if Jonathan was already 10 moves ahead. Mac forced himself to stand, to think. He needed to get home, needed to see Sarah and Emma, to hold on to the one thing that mattered before. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Dad, Emma's asleep, but she wanted me to tell you she drew you a picture. A superhero grandpa. Can't wait to show you tomorrow. Mac's chest tightened. Tomorrow. Would there even be a tomorrow for the life he'd built? Or was Jonathan already pulling strings that would unravel everything? He gathered the scattered pages of his journal, trying to ignore how his hands trembled. As he reached for the last page, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy, deliberate, moving with purpose. Working late again, Marcus? Mac spun around. A woman emerged from the shadows near the service elevator, tall, silver-haired, wearing a coat that cost more than he made in 6 months. It took him a moment to recognize her without the surgical enhancements and careful lighting of press photos. Victoria Hartwell, former studio head, current member of the Academy's Board of Governors. A woman whose career had survived 3 decades of industry upheaval through sheer ruthlessness and an uncanny ability to destroy her enemies before they knew they were enemies. Victoria. Mac's voice came out steady despite the chaos in his chest. Visiting the help at this hour? That's unusually democratic of you. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against concrete. In the harsh basement lighting, she looked older than her publicity photos, but her eyes held the same predatory intelligence that had once made agents cross the street to avoid her. I got an interesting phone call tonight, she said, from someone I thought was dead. Apparently, he's very much alive and asking questions about old friends. Mac felt the walls closing in. If Jonathan was reaching out to Victoria, then the game had already begun, and Mac was starting 10 moves behind. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victoria smiled, the same expression she'd worn when she'd fired half the studio's development team in a single afternoon. "Oh, Marcus, still playing the broken security guard? It's a good performance, but we both know better." She circled him slowly, like a shark testing the waters. 30 years ago, you vanished. Just gone. Left behind whispers and speculation and a very interesting vacancy in the power structure. Some of us always wondered what really happened to the great Marcus McQueen. Mac's mouth felt like sand. Some things are better left buried. "Are they?" Victoria stopped in front of him, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Expensive, predatory. "Because our mutual friend seems to think it's time for a resurrection, and frankly, Marcus, that terrifies me more than anything else in this god-forsaken town." The admission hung in the air between them. Victoria Hartwell, afraid. If she was scared enough to seek him out in a basement at 1 in the morning, then Jonathan's reach was already wider than Mac had imagined. "What did he tell you?" "Enough." Victoria's composure cracked slightly, revealing something Mac hadn't seen in decades. Genuine fear. Enough to know that whatever protection we thought we had died the day he walked out of federal prison. She pulled an envelope from her coat, pressed it into Mac's hands. "He wants a meeting. Tomorrow night. The 3 of us. Just like old times." Mac stared at the envelope. Heavy paper, expensive. His name written in Jonathan's careful script. "And if I don't come?" Then he starts making phone calls. To reporters, to prosecutors, to anyone who might find our shared history illuminating. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. "He knows about Rebecca, Marcus. He knows what really happened that night." The envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Inside would be an address, a time, and probably something else. Some little detail that proved Jonathan knew exactly how much leverage he held. "How many others has he contacted?" "I don't know. But if I had to guess, everyone who mattered back then. Everyone who's still breathing." Victoria headed toward the elevator, pausing at the doors. "Welcome back to the game, Marcus. I hope you remember how to play." The elevator doors closed, leaving Mac alone with the envelope and the terrible certainty that his carefully constructed world was already burning. He thought of Emma's picture, superhero grandpa, and wondered if heroes could survive the resurrection of their own ghosts. Outside, somewhere in the Hollywood Hills, Jonathan Steinfeld was making his next move, and Mac realized he'd forgotten how to be afraid until now. Mac's hands trembled as he tore open Jonathan's envelope, the heavy paper releasing a faint scent of cedar and old money. Inside, a single sheet of letterhead from the Beverly Hills Hotel. The address was written in Jonathan's familiar script, Penthouse Suite 912. Tomorrow, 10 p.m. Come alone, but bring your conscience. Below that, a photograph. Mac's knees nearly buckled. It was Rebecca, 30 years younger, laughing at something off camera. She wore the blue dress from that last night, the one she'd never lived to see morning in. But it wasn't the image that made Mac's world tilt sideways. It was what was written on the back in Jonathan's careful handwriting. She was going to tell them everything. You know what had to be done. The basement corridor spun around him. Mac pressed his back against the lockers, struggling to breathe. For 3 decades he'd carried the weight of that night, had rebuilt his entire existence around the fundamental lie that Rebecca's death was an accident. But Jonathan knew, had always known. His phone rang again. Unknown number. "Did you like my little gift?" Jonathan's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess master revealing checkmate. "I had that photograph developed from an old negative. Amazing what you can preserve if you're patient enough. You bastard." The words came out raw, scraped from somewhere deep in Mac's chest. Now. Is that any way to speak to an old friend? Especially one who kept your secret all these years? Jonathan's laugh held no warmth, though I suppose kept isn't quite accurate. More like stored for the right occasion. Mac closed his eyes, seeing Rebecca's face as clearly as if she were standing before him. The way she'd looked when she'd confronted him that night, when she'd discovered what he and Jonathan had really been doing with the studio's money. The federal contracts they'd been manipulating, the foreign investments they'd been laundering. She'd been horrified, disgusted, and determined to expose them both. She was going to destroy us, Mac whispered, the words tasting like ashes. She was going to destroy everything. Your career, my empire. Victoria's carefully constructed web of influence. Dozens of careers, hundreds of jobs, thousands of investors who trusted us with their money. Jonathan's voice hardened. You did what had to be done, Mac. What any rational man would have done. But Mac remembered the look in Rebecca's eyes when she'd fallen down those stairs. The way her neck had twisted at an impossible angle. The sound her head had made against the marble floor of their Malibu home. An accident. That's what the police report said. A tragic fall after too much wine at a party. Rebecca had been drinking, the stairs were dark, these things happened in houses built on hills. No one questioned it, especially not when Marcus McQueen was so clearly devastated by his young wife's death. You've spent 30 years hiding from the truth, Jonathan interrupted, pretending that pushing her was some momentary lapse in judgment. But we both know better, don't we? We both know you had help cleaning up the scene, making sure the angles looked right, making sure the wine glass ended up in exactly the right place. Mac's reflection stared back at him from the vending machine glass, a broken man in a security guard's uniform. But behind his eyes, something else stirred. The cold calculation that had once made Marcus McQueen the most feared executive in Hollywood. What do you want, Jonathan? I want you to remember who you really are. 30 years of playing the grieving widower, the broken man haunted by tragedy. It's been a masterful performance. But Dylan Cross threatens all of that, doesn't he? Mac's blood went cold. What does Cross have to do with any of this? Everything. Jonathan's voice carried triumph, because young Dylan has been asking questions about Meridian's investors, about certain shell companies, about financial records that go back 3 decades. He's ambitious, Mac, dangerously ambitious, and ambitious young men have a habit of digging up buried secrets. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Cross's backing from Meridian wasn't just about financing films, it was about legitimizing money that had been buried since the night Rebecca died. Money that connected to federal contracts, to overseas investments, to the very crimes Rebecca had died trying to expose. He doesn't know what he's looking for, Mac said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were wishful thinking. Not yet. But he's getting close. And when he finds what he's looking for, when he connects Marcus McQueen to the financial irregularities that destroyed 3 careers and sent me to federal prison, what do you think happens to your quiet little life? Mac thought of Sarah, of Emma's drawing, of the carefully constructed normalcy he'd built around his monstrous secret. Everything would burn. Not just his reputation or his freedom, everything. Sarah would learn that her father was a killer. Emma would grow up knowing her grandfather had murdered her grandmother. Tomorrow night, Jonathan continued, we finish this, all of us, the way we should have 30 years ago. The line went dead, leaving Mac alone with the photograph and the terrible weight of choices that could never be undone. In the silence that followed, he finally understood. Jonathan hadn't orchestrated tonight to destroy him. He'd orchestrated it to bring him home. Mac stared at the photograph until Rebecca's face blurred through the fluorescent haze. The basement felt like a coffin, the walls pressing closer with each labored breath. 30 years of carefully constructed lies, and Jonathan had just torn through them with 5 words, you know what had to be done. But something was wrong with the photograph. Mac held it closer to the light, studying the details he'd missed in his initial shock. The timestamp in the corner read 3 days after Rebecca's death. The blue dress, the one he remembered so clearly from that final night, was wrinkled differently. The background showed palm fronds that hadn't existed in their Malibu garden. His hands went cold as understanding crashed over him like ice water. Rebecca wasn't dead. The realization hit him with such force that he actually gasped, the sound echoing off concrete walls like a gunshot. 30 years. 30 years of guilt, of self-imposed exile, of building his entire identity around the weight of a murder that never happened. Mac's mind raced backward through decades of carefully curated memories. The night of the party. Rebecca's confrontation about the financial irregularities. The argument that had escalated until she threatened to expose everything. The push at the top of the stairs. Except now, through the lens of this impossible photograph, that memory felt different, softer around the edges. Like something viewed through water. He pulled out his phone with shaking fingers and dialed the number Jonathan had called from. Surprised? Jonathan's voice held 30 years of satisfaction. She's alive. Mac's words came out broken, barely a whisper. Very much so. Living quite comfortably in Switzerland, actually. Amazing what federal witness protection can accomplish when properly motivated. Jonathan's laugh was cruel music. You should see her now, Mac. She's aged beautifully, still asks about you sometimes. The basement corridor tilted sideways. Mac pressed his palm against the concrete wall, needing something solid to anchor him to reality. You let me think. For 30 years, you let me believe that you were a killer? That you'd pushed your wife down a flight of stairs in a moment of rage? Jonathan's voice carried mock sympathy. Oh, Marcus, you were always so eager to see yourself as the villain of the story. Made you so much easier to control. Mac's reflection in the vending machine glass looked like a stranger. Everything he'd built his identity around. The guilt, the self-imposed punishment, the careful distance from power and ambition. All of it constructed around a lie. Not his lie. Jonathan's. The wine glass, the angles. You said I had help cleaning up the scene. I did help clean up a scene. Just not the one you remember. Jonathan's voice hardened. Rebecca was very much alive when she left that house. Unconscious from the drugs I'd slipped into her drink, but breathing. Amazing how memory works, isn't it? How trauma can make a man see murder where there was merely relocation. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. The gaps in Mac's memory from that night, the way certain details had always felt fuzzy, uncertain. Jonathan hadn't helped him cover up a crime. He'd drugged Mac too, enough to make him compliant, suggestible, enough to plant false memories that would keep him controlled for 3 decades. You needed me broken, Mac said, understanding flooding through him like poison. You needed me to believe I was a monster so I'd never come back, never reclaim what was mine. What was ours? Jonathan corrected. The empire we built together, the networks, the influence, the perfectly orchestrated web of corruption that made us both rich beyond imagination. With you gone and me in prison, it all went to Victoria. She's done well with it, I'll give her that. Mac thought of Victoria's fear in the basement, her desperate need to involve him in whatever Jonathan was planning. She hadn't been afraid of Mac's return to power. She'd been afraid of losing it. Rebecca was going to expose us, Mac said, testing the edges of his restored memory. Rebecca was going to destroy everything. So I made her disappear and convinced you that you'd killed her. 2 birds, 1 very elegant stone. Jonathan's satisfaction was palpable. Though I must admit, watching you torture yourself all these years has been educational. Mac's phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. Dad, are you okay? You seemed distracted at dinner. Emma's worried her superhero picture wasn't good enough. Emma's drawing. His granddaughter, who saw him as a hero, not a killer. Because he wasn't a killer, had never been a killer. The security guard uniform, Mac said slowly. The night shift, making me watch over the kingdom I used to rule. Poetic justice, though I prefer to think of it as extended therapy. Jonathan chuckled. But now it's time to come home, Marcus. Because Dylan Cross is about to expose financial irregularities that will bring down everyone who profited from our little empire. Including Victoria. Including me. And unless we stop him, including Rebecca, Mac finished, the final piece clicking into place. The line went silent for a moment. When Jonathan spoke again, his voice carried genuine surprise. Very good. Yes, including Rebecca. Swiss bank accounts can be frozen, witness protection can be revoked, and 30-year-old murder charges can be refiled. If Cross connects the right dots, we all burn together. Mac closed his eyes and saw Emma's drawing again, superhero grandpa. For 30 years he'd believed himself capable of murder. Now he understood the truth was far more complex and far more dangerous. Tomorrow night, he said quietly. I'll be there. But as he hung up the phone, Mac realized something Jonathan hadn't counted on. A man who'd spent 30 years believing he was a monster had no fear of becoming one. Mac stared at his reflection in the darkened window of his apartment, but instead of the broken security guard he'd grown accustomed to seeing, something else looked back, the ghost of Marcus McQueen, the man who'd once commanded boardrooms and bent Hollywood to his will. For the first time in 30 years, those two identities were beginning to merge. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Sarah's contact. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before he set the device aside. Some conversations required preparation. Some truths demanded the right words, spoken at the right time, by a man who finally knew which version of himself was real. Instead, he opened his laptop and began typing names into search engines. Jonathan Steinfeld, Victoria Hartwell, Meridian Entertainment, Dylan Cross. The digital trail painted a picture of interconnected power that made his old empire look quaint by comparison. Shell companies within shell companies, investments flowing through offshore accounts, federal contracts worth hundreds of millions. Rebecca had tried to expose a financial conspiracy 30 years ago. Cross was stumbling towards something much larger now. Mac's phone rang. Sarah's name lit up the screen. "Dad? It's late, but I couldn't sleep." Something felt wrong after dinner. Her voice carried the same intuitive concern she'd shown as a child when she'd sensed storms coming before the first clouds appeared. Mac had forgotten how perceptive she was, how much she'd inherited from both her parents. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just working through some old memories." "About Mom?" Sarah's question was gentle but direct. "You've been different lately, like something's changed." Mac closed his eyes, weighing his words carefully. What if everything you thought you knew about a situation turned out to be wrong? What if the person you'd believed yourself to be was incomplete? "Dad, you're scaring me a little." "I'm sorry. Max stopped, hearing his own voice crack with 30 years of accumulated grief. "I loved your mother more than life itself. I want you to know that. Whatever else happens, whatever you learn about me or about her, that was always true." Sarah's silence stretched long enough that Mac wondered if the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Dad, what's going on? I may have some difficult conversations ahead of me with people from the past, and afterward, some things might come to light that will be challenging to understand. Are you in trouble?" Mac almost laughed at the simplicity of the question. Trouble seemed like such an inadequate word for the web of deception that was finally unraveling around him. "I'm not sure yet, but I need you to know that everything I've done, everything I've chosen, has been to protect you and Emma. That will never change. Dad, you're really frightening me now." "I know. I'm sorry." Mac rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of decisions he could no longer postpone. "Can you do something for me? Take Emma somewhere safe tomorrow night. Visit your aunt in San Diego, maybe. Just don't be home. Marcus McQueen. You tell me what's happening right now." The use of his full name, something Sarah only did when she was channeling her mother's authority, stopped Mac cold. For a moment, Rebecca's voice echoed through the phone line, carried in their daughter's inflection. "Your mother isn't dead." The words escaped before Mac could stop them, torn from some deep place where truth had been buried under decades of manufactured guilt. The silence that followed felt like falling. "What did you say?" Mac's hands shook as he gripped the phone. "I said your mother isn't dead. She's alive, Sarah. She's been alive this whole time." "That's impossible. I was at her funeral. I threw dirt on her coffin. I know how it sounds. I know what we all believed. But I was wrong. We were all wrong. Or rather, we were made to believe something that wasn't true." Mac's voice grew stronger as the weight of 30 years of lies finally began to lift. "Tomorrow night, I'm going to find out exactly what happened. I'm going to learn who I really am." Sarah's breathing was audible through the phone, quick and shallow. "This is insane, Dad. People don't just fake their deaths for 30 years. People with the right connections do. People who know things that powerful men want to keep buried." Max stood and walked to his window, looking out at the sprawling lights of Los Angeles. "I was someone else once, Sarah, before the security guard, before the quiet widower. I was someone who understood how this city really works. And you're going to be that person again?" Mac considered the question, feeling something cold and calculating unfurl in his chest, something that had been sleeping for 3 decades. "I don't think I have a choice." When he hung up, Mac realized he'd crossed the point of no return. Tomorrow night, Marcus McQueen would rise from his own grave, and God help anyone who stood in his way. Climax. The next evening found Mac standing before the mirror in his apartment, adjusting a tie he hadn't worn in 30 years. The charcoal suit still fit perfectly, Italian wool that had once commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose entirely. His reflection showed a man transformed. Gone was the stooped posture of the night security guard, replaced by the straight-backed confidence of someone who'd once owned half of Hollywood. The weight of false guilt had lifted, but something heavier had taken its place, the cold certainty of what needed to be done. Mac's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, Pacific Palisades House, 9 p.m., come alone, J. The same address where it had all begun 30 years ago, where Jonathan had orchestrated the elaborate charade that had convinced Mac he was a killer. How fitting that it would end there as well. Mac arrived at the sprawling glass house perched on the cliff overlooking the Pacific just as the sun disappeared into the ocean. The architectural masterpiece looked exactly as he remembered. All clean lines and impossible angles, designed to intimidate visitors while providing its owner with commanding views of the city below. Jonathan Steinfeld stood silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows, his silver hair catching the last rays of daylight. Despite his 73 years and the decade he'd spent in federal prison, he moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Victoria Hartwell sat rigidly in a leather chair nearby, her usual composure cracked around the edges. Marcus. Jonathan's smile was warm and terrible. You look restored. I feel it. Max stepped into the room, noting the strategic placement of furniture, the single exit, the way Victoria's eyes tracked his movement like a cornered animal's. Though I have to admit, discovering you're not a murderer takes some adjustment. I imagine it does. Jonathan gestured toward a bar cart lined with crystal decanters. Drink? We have much to discuss. I'll pass. I've learned to be cautious about what you put in my glass. Jonathan's laugh was genuinely delighted. There he is. The Marcus McQueen who built an empire from nothing. I wondered if he still existed under all that manufactured guilt. He never left. You just buried him under lies. Mac remained standing, maintaining the tactical advantage of mobility. Where is she, Jonathan? Rebecca? Jonathan moved to the windows, gazing out at the lights beginning to twinkle across Los Angeles. Closer than you think, farther than you'd imagine. Stop playing games. But games are what we do, Marcus, what we've always done. The only difference is that now you remember the rules. Victoria shifted in her chair, speaking for the first time since Mac's arrival. He's coming tonight, Cross. Jonathan promised him information about Meridian's backing, about the shell companies. He doesn't know what he's walking into. Mac felt the pieces of Jonathan's plan crystallizing with horrible clarity. You're going to kill him. We're going to eliminate a threat, Jonathan corrected smoothly. Just as we eliminated the threat Rebecca posed 30 years ago. The only difference is that this time, you'll participate knowingly. And if I refuse? Jonathan pulled out his phone and touched the screen. The sound of a woman's voice filled the room. Older now, tinged with a Swiss accent but unmistakably familiar. Marcus, if you're hearing this, then Jonathan has finally decided to call in his markers. I want you to know that I never blamed you for that night. You were as much his victim as I was. Rebecca's voice, alive, real, speaking words that confirmed everything Mac had pieced together. She recorded that message 5 years ago, Jonathan said casually, just before her witness protection status was compromised. Swiss authorities found her body last week. Tragic accident, apparently. Hiking in the Alps can be so dangerous. The room tilted sideways. Mac gripped the back of a chair, feeling the foundations of his newly restored world crumble again. You killed her. I protected us all from exposure. Rebecca was becoming sentimental, wanting to reach out to you, to Sarah. 30 years of safety, and she was going to throw it away for a tearful reunion. Jonathan's voice hardened. I couldn't allow that. Mac looked at Victoria, seeing his own horror reflected in her eyes. You knew. I found out yesterday, she whispered. That's why I called you. I thought if you were involved, If you helped us handle Cross, maybe Jonathan wouldn't— Wouldn't what? Kill you too? Mac's voice was deadly quiet. Do you really think there's any version of this where either of us walks away? The sound of a car in the driveway cut through the tension. Dylan Cross, arriving precisely on time, walking into a trap 30 years in the making. But as Mac watched headlights sweep across the windows, he realized something Jonathan had miscalculated. A man who'd spent 3 decades believing he was capable of murder had learned to think like one. Tonight, that education would finally prove useful. The doorbell's chime echoed through the glass house like a funeral bell. Mac watched Jonathan's face, saw the predatory satisfaction there, and felt something crystallize inside him. Not the manufactured guilt that had poisoned 30 years of his life, but something colder, cleaner. "Answer it," Jonathan commanded Victoria, but his eyes never left Mac's face. "And Marcus? Remember that any heroic gestures will only delay the inevitable. Cross dies tonight. The only question is whether you join him." Victoria moved toward the door on unsteady legs, but Mac's voice stopped her. "Wait." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it so Jonathan could see the screen. A recording app, active for the past 20 minutes. Rebecca's message. Your confession about killing her. Your plan for Cross. Mac's smile held no warmth. All uploaded to a cloud server with instructions to forward to the FBI, the Los Angeles Times, and Dylan Cross's personal attorney if I don't check in by midnight. Jonathan's composure cracked for the first time. You're bluffing. 30 years as a security guard teaches you to be thorough about evidence. 30 years believing you're a killer teaches you to think 3 moves ahead. Mac pocketed the phone. You created a monster, Jonathan. Time to meet him. The doorbell rang again, more insistently. Victoria stood frozen between the 2 men, her face a mask of terror. Let him in, Mac said quietly. But when he walks through that door, you're going to tell him everything. About Meridian, about the federal contracts, about the shell companies. All of it. That will destroy us all, Jonathan hissed. No, Mac said. And for the first time in 30 years, his voice carried the absolute authority that had once commanded Hollywood. That will destroy you. The rest of us are going to survive. Victoria opened the door with shaking hands. Dylan Cross strode in, his usual arrogance intact, but Mac caught the subtle signs of nervousness, the way his eyes swept the room, cataloging exits and threats. Whatever Cross was, he wasn't stupid. Gentlemen, Cross said, his voice carrying forced confidence, I have to admit this is an unexpected gathering. Sit down, Dylan, Mac said, gesturing to the couch. His tone was conversational, almost gentle. There are some things you need to know. Cross remained standing, his gaze shifting between the 3 of them. Actually, I think I'll hear them standing. Call it professional paranoia. Smart man, Mac said approvingly. Jonathan here was planning to kill you tonight, make it look like an accident, the same way he killed Rebecca McQueen 30 years ago. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cross's hand moved slowly toward his jacket pocket, and Mac caught the slight bulge that suggested a recording device. The young producer had come prepared. Jonathan laughed, but the sound held a desperate edge. Marcus, you're being dramatic. The Swiss authorities will confirm Rebecca's death by week's end, Mac continued, his voice never wavering. Jonathan arranged it because she was going to expose the network you've been investigating. The same network that's been funneling federal defense contracts through Meridian Entertainment for over a decade. Cross's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent, letting Mac speak. Victoria has the financial records, Mac said, glancing at the woman who'd helped orchestrate his exile. Don't you, Victoria? She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. Offshore accounts, shell companies in 6 countries. It's all in my office safe. She looked at Cross with something like relief. The combination is my daughter's birthday, April 15th, 1992. Jonathan moved toward the bar cart, but Mac stepped smoothly into his path. Up close, Mac could see that his old partner was finally showing his age, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had become labored. It's over, Jonathan, Mac said softly. The only question now is whether you walk out of here in handcuffs or a body bag. You think you've won? Jonathan's voice cracked with fury. "You think exposing me will bring her back? Will give you back the 30 years I stole?" Mac considered the question seriously. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Los Angeles spread out below them like a circuit board, 10 million lights marking 10 million stories of ambition and loss. Somewhere out there, Sarah was holding Emma close, both of them safe from the poison that had infected Mac's life for so long. "No," Mac said finally, "but it gives me something better." "What?" Mac pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. Peace. 20 minutes later, as federal agents led Jonathan away in handcuffs and paramedics checked Victoria for shock, Dylan Cross approached Mac on the cliffside terrace. "Why?" Cross asked simply. Mac thought of Emma's superhero drawing, still tucked in his wallet, of Sarah's voice on the phone, calling him by his full name with Rebecca's inflection, of 30 years of false guilt finally lifted, replaced by something harder but infinitely more honest. "Because some stories," Mac said quietly, "deserve their proper ending."